Living on the outskirts of Wyoming's vast wilderness was exactly what I had dreamed of when I made the decision to leave city life behind. The isolation that might have terrified others was exactly what drew me to this place, hundreds of acres of my own land, where the nearest neighbor was miles away and the only sounds at night were the wind through the grass and the distant calls of coyotes. My house was small but comfortable, a cozy refuge that felt like a fortress of solitude in the best possible way. The spring of 2019 brought with it an unusual weather pattern, day after day of heavy rain that turned the dirt roads to mud and made the whole world feel gray and soggy. Most days I didn't mind the rain. It was peaceful in its own way, drumming on the roof and streaming down the windows while I worked or watched television. The sound created a cocoon of white noise that made the house feel even more separate from the outside world. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where the rain had been falling steadily all day and showed no signs of stopping. I had settled in for a quiet night, the kind I'd grown to love since moving here. The television provided gentle background noise while I relaxed, feeling grateful for the warmth and dryness of my small sanctuary while nature unleashed its fury outside. The knock at the door was so unexpected that at first I thought I'd imagined it. Who would be out in weather like this? Who would travel the miles of muddy roads just to reach my isolated property? I had to strain to hear it over the sound of the rain, but there it was again, deliberate, persistent knocking that demanded attention. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see a young man standing on my porch, completely soaked from head to toe. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with the kind of bedraggled appearance that spoke of someone who had been caught in the storm for some time. Water dripped from his hair and clothes, forming small puddles on my covered porch. "How can I help you?" I asked, trying to maintain a friendly tone despite the strangeness of the situation. My first instinct was to assume he was a neighbor from down the road, perhaps someone whose car had broken down or who needed help with some kind of emergency. His story seemed plausible enough at first. He claimed he'd been camping in the woods nearby and had gotten into some kind of trouble. He wasn't specific about what kind of trouble, but given the weather and the remoteness of the area, it wasn't hard to imagine someone getting lost or having their camp washed out by the rain. He needed a place to stay for the night, he said, looking at me with eyes that seemed to be measuring my reaction. I'll admit, part of me felt sorry for him. The rain was coming down harder now, and the temperature was dropping. Anyone caught out in weather like this would be miserable, possibly even in danger from exposure. But something about the situation didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he looked past me into the house when he spoke, or the way his request felt more like a demand than a plea for help. The logical part of my brain kicked in. I was miles from town, completely alone, and this was a complete stranger asking to spend the night in my home. No matter how sympathetic I might feel, it would be foolish and potentially dangerous to let him inside. Instead, I offered what seemed like a reasonable compromise. I could let him use my phone to call someone for help, to arrange for a ride into town where he could find proper shelter. His reaction to this offer was immediate and telling. He didn't seem grateful for the alternative I was providing. He didn't ask to use the phone or inquire about getting help. Instead, his expression hardened, and without another word, he turned and walked away from my door. I watched him go, following his progress down my long driveway until he reached the main road. But instead of continuing toward town or flagging down a passing vehicle, he did something that made my stomach clench with unease. He veered off the road and disappeared into the woods, moving with a purpose that suggested he knew exactly where he was going. The encounter left me feeling unsettled, but I tried to push the feeling aside. I returned to the living room, turned up the volume on the television, and attempted to recapture the peaceful evening I had been enjoying. The man was gone, I told myself. Whatever his story had been, whatever trouble he'd claimed to be in, it was no longer my concern. But the feeling of unease lingered. Something about the interaction had felt wrong from the beginning, and his abrupt departure into the woods rather than towards civilization only reinforced my instinct that there had been more to his visit than a simple request for shelter. Hours passed. The rain continued its relentless assault on the roof and windows, and I gradually began to relax again. I didn't check the time often, but it had to be well past 9 o'clock when something outside caught my attention, a strange, flickering orange light visible through the window that faced my backyard. I got up and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer out into the storm. There, in the middle of the woods behind my house, was a small campfire burning under a large tree. Despite the heavy rain, someone had managed to keep a fire alive, and as I watched, I could make out the dark silhouette of a figure standing beside it. The figure was holding something long and straight that could have been a walking stick or a tool of some kind. In the dancing light of the flames and through the distortion of the rain-covered window, it was impossible to tell if the person was facing toward my house or looking away into the woods. But the very fact that someone was out there, so close to my home in the middle of such a terrible storm, sent chills down my spine. I didn't need to wonder who it was. The timing was too coincidental, the location too close to be random. The man who had knocked on my door hours earlier hadn't left at all. He had simply moved his camp to my backyard, positioning himself where he could watch my house while remaining partially concealed by the trees. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to call the police. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, the earlier visit, the man's departure into the woods, and now the campfire visible from my window. She assured me that officers would be sent out, but warned me that given the remote location and the weather conditions, it might take some time for them to arrive. An hour, she said. Maybe more. I would have to wait out this situation on my own for at least that long, with a stranger camped in my backyard for reasons I couldn't fathom and didn't want to discover. After I hung up with the police, I checked the window again. The fire was still burning, a small but persistent beacon in the darkness, but I could no longer see the figure beside it. Had he moved away from the fire? Was he still out there, hidden in the shadows? The not knowing was almost worse than seeing him. Then I heard footsteps. Not the random sounds of an animal moving through the woods, but the deliberate footfalls of someone walking with purpose. The steps were coming toward the house, growing louder despite the rain. I ran to another window and caught a glimpse of him as he passed by, the same man from my porch, but now carrying what was unmistakably a hunting rifle in his hands. The sight of that weapon transformed my concern into genuine terror. This wasn't someone lost or in trouble. This wasn't someone seeking help or shelter. This was someone who had come prepared for violence, someone who had planned this encounter from the beginning. He reached my front door and began banging on it with more force than before. The sound echoed through the house, each impact making me flinch. But I didn't respond. I couldn't respond. I was frozen with fear, pressed against the wall in my hallway, trying to think of what to do next. When I didn't answer, the banging stopped for a moment. Then it resumed, but with a different quality, the sharp, cracking sound of wood being struck with the stock of a rifle. He was trying to break down my door, using his weapon as a battering ram to force his way inside. I could hear the wood beginning to splinter, could see one of the panels starting to bow inward under the repeated impacts. In moments, he would be inside my house, and I would be trapped with an armed intruder whose intentions I could only imagine. My own handgun was in the hallway closet, and I managed to reach it despite my shaking hands. I had hoped never to use it for anything more serious than scaring off coyotes, but now it felt like my only chance of survival. I positioned myself near the door frame, taking aim at the area where I expected him to appear when the door finally gave way. The decision to fire a warning shot was instinctive rather than calculated. I aimed toward the edge of the door frame and pulled the trigger, the deafening sound of the gunshot filling the house and temporarily robbing me of my hearing. For several seconds, all I could perceive was the ringing in my ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder. When my hearing returned, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No more banging. No more splintering wood. No more footsteps on my porch. I waited several minutes before gathering the courage to look through the peephole, half expecting to see him still standing there, waiting for another opportunity. But the porch was empty. Looking out into the yard, I could see footprints in the mud leading away from the house, clear evidence of someone running away quickly after the shot was fired. The single gunshot had been enough to send him fleeing into the night. When the police finally arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the area around the campfire. What they found there validated my worst fears and revealed that the situation had been even more dangerous than I'd realized. Hidden near where the fire had been burning, they discovered a duffel bag that had obviously been buried in the ground and recently dug up. contents of that bag painted a chilling picture of premeditation and violent intent. According to the officers, it contained what they described as either a burglary kit or possibly even a murder kit, tools and supplies that had been strategically placed in advance, waiting to be retrieved when needed. The implications were terrifying. This hadn't been a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. Someone had planned this attack, had scouted my property, had buried supplies in my woods, and had waited for the right opportunity to execute whatever plan they had in mind. The story about being a lost camper had been a complete fabrication, a cover story designed to get inside my house where I would be vulnerable and isolated. The fact that he had asked to stay the night took on a sinister new meaning. If I had agreed, if I had let him inside out of sympathy for his supposed plight, what would have happened? Would I have made it through the night? Would anyone have even known to look for me out here in the middle of nowhere? For years have passed since that night, and the man was never identified or caught. The police investigation turned up no leads, no connections to other crimes, no evidence that might point to who he was or where he had come from. He had vanished into the Wyoming wilderness as completely as if he had never existed at all. I still live in the same house, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I refused to let fear drive me away from the place I chose to call home. But the isolation that once felt like freedom now carries an edge of constant vigilance. Every unexpected sound makes me alert. Every visitor is regarded with suspicion until proven harmless. The woods behind my house look different now. I can no longer look at them without remembering the orange glow of that campfire, without wondering if someone might be watching from the tree lean. The very remoteness that drew me to this place, the miles of empty land, the absence of neighbors, the distance from help, now feels like a vulnerability rather than an asset. Sometimes I wonder about the man's other potential victims. Was I the first person he had targeted, or had there been others? Had he refined his approach through previous encounters? Were there people who had been less fortunate than I was, who hadn't been armed, who hadn't been suspicious enough to refuse his initial request? The questions haunt me because they can never be answered. Somewhere out there, a man with violent intentions is still free, still carrying whatever twisted motivations drove him to bury a murder kit in a stranger's woods and attempt to break into their home with a rifle. The only thing I know for certain is that he had planned it all in advance, and that makes him far more dangerous than any random criminal. The memory of that night serves as a constant reminder that even in the most isolated places, even when we think we're safe from the dangers of the world, predators can find us. They can plan and prepare and wait for their moment, using our very isolation against us. The price of the peace and solitude I sought is eternal vigilance, and the knowledge that sometimes the thing that saves your life is nothing more than the instinct to trust your fear when a stranger comes knocking in the dark.